Is it on? Oh, it's on now. Okay. All right. That's what turns it on when you say, how do you turn this thing on? It comes on, right? My name is Janice Allen. I volunteer with the Veterans History Museum of the Carolinas, and it's so good to see you here for our return engagement of our author, James Scott. I wanted to let you know a few things, some news about the museum before our speaker is introduced in just a moment. First of all, we want to thank our sponsors. You'll see them listed over here on this bulletin board: Ace Hardware. Who else? Walter, read them out for me. I can't see it. E-Golf Motors. O.B. Taylor's. The Cherry Tree. TVS. We thank them for making these programs possible. Thank you, Walter. And when you are there buying your Jeep, let them know that you saw that they are a sponsor for the museum. Also, if you have served our country, are a veteran of any of the services at any time, would you please raise your hand? All right. We thank you for your sacrifice and your service. Who saw our video last week at the Co-ed Cinema? Wow, a lot of people. We've had great reviews from that. We thank you for coming. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a brand new, professionally produced history of each war from World War I to the current war on terror. They are now available in the museum galleries. Each one is 6 to 7 minutes long. Volunteers Michael Robertson, Carl Newman, Susan Toscani, and Joni Pavlik from our museum, along with professional video company, produced it. And so if you come into the museum, you'll be able to see each one of these in the gallery that where the story is told. So we invite you to come and look at those if you didn't get an opportunity last week. Speaking of coming into the museum, we have some good news. The museum is going to be open this year all the way through New Year's Eve. In the past, we have not been able to have it open all the way through the holidays, but this year, except for Thanksgiving Day, New Year's Eve, Christmas Eve, and Christmas Day. Is that right, Carl? We have more volunteers than we've ever had before, and we have the ability to keep it open Tuesday through Saturday, 11 to 3. So when you, on the day after Thanksgiving, when you need to get up and do some walking and get some exercise, bring all the family members in and come in on Friday, on Black Friday, to the museum. Harold, come on up front, please. I just saw Harold Wellington, our World War II veteran. Come on up. We have a seat for you right up here. I would like to ask all museum volunteers to come to the front of the room for a moment, please. All museum volunteers. Come on up. And that includes Harold. Keep him up here too, Michael. Don't let him go. Keep him up here too. He's a museum volunteer. All right. We would like to have Greg Eyre be in the middle of this group, and I want you to move in closely. I'm just going to do this because we're going to take a picture after.
1, 2, 3. I'll be over here then.
Okay, and Harold. Emmett has.
Together.
Today, just 1 second. Today is our last program of the year. We've had wonderful programs, and Emmett has something to say about this.
For those that don't know me, my name is Emmett Cassietta. I'm the founder of the museum. And it is so special today because we have so many volunteers that we're able to open all the way through to New Year's. And you know what makes me happy is the fact to see all you out here too supporting us. That is so important. And you know, it gives me great pleasure right now to award one of our volunteers who I could truly say took the bull by the horns and made it happen for our lecture circuit. And he's did an outstanding job, and I'm so proud to be able, the person to hand him this great certificate of appreciation. I'm going to read it to you. The Veterans History Museum of the Carolinas presents this certificate to Gregory Earn for keeping our museum vibrant in the public's eye with our lectures, for excellent press releases based on your understanding of our speakers' topics, for expanding our online presence with videos of the programs, for adding an interesting variety of venues to our lineup, for our passion and respect for veteran stories. It is a great pleasure to give this award in appreciation to Mr. Gregory Earn. You know, we started this museum with a table, and now you can see what we have done with it. So it's so important that we keep this museum in Transylvania County. So when you hear us in a couple of years begging for money to stay alive, I'm hoping you guys get up and help us out. I really do. Anyway, Mr. Gregory Earn.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Get into 2 rows for our photographer for the paper, please. He's the boss because he's got a big camera. Anybody with a big camera must be obeyed, right?
Wide angle lens.
Is that enough, Walter? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you guys very much.
I want to let you know that Greg is handing over he's passing the baton to Mike Bazinet, who was up here, who you've met before at these programs, and Mike McCarthy, who will be carrying on in this fine tradition of speakers beginning next year. So watch the paper and watch your emails for what's coming up in the early part of next year. Now I want to introduce some very special people to you. We have 5 World War II veterans sitting on the front row up here. And we want to thank them for their service. We like to celebrate birthdays. We can't do it every month because it's kind of challenging to get everybody together. But we like to have a celebration where we can let you know about recent birthdays and birthdays coming up. And after the program today, we're going to serve cupcakes back here on these tables to celebrate the birthdays. And so you have 2 exciting things to do after the program. Have a cupcake, meet the veterans, and then don't walk over to the museum to get your copy of James Scott's new book that he'll be talking about today. It's at the museum. It's $35, tax included, and he will sign the book and chat with you over at the museum. So those are your offerings. So may I ask the World War II veterans to stand, please, while I let me introduce you. And turn, if you would, turn toward the group, please. Walter, maybe if you could get a picture for us of these 2. We're so glad to have our professional photographer from Connecticut here to do this for us today. First of all, he wants us closer together. He is so bossy. He's always okay. Great. So this is Harold Wellington, who served in the Merchant Marine and the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy, and had a birthday about 6 weeks ago to become 98. Harold Wellington. All the way to the other end next for Ed Cottrell, who served as a pilot in the Battle of the Bulge, flying P-47, 65 missions, correct? Yep. And he will celebrate his very next birthday in January.
101. Elsie Poor right here. Elsie Poor, okay. Served as a U.S. Marine Corps aircraft mechanic in the Philippines, and then after World War II was over in China. Mr. Elsie Poor. This is Miss Dorothy Manigan. She served as a nurse in Washington State, in Fort Lewis, in the hospital, which was one of the big receiving hospitals for our prisoners of war after the War of the Pacific was over, coming back and being brought back after being imprisoned and tortured and all the worst things that you've read about. This is one of the first beautiful smiling faces they saw when they got into the hospital.
It was a privilege to be there.
Dorothy's birthday is January 5th, and she will be 100. And I'm going to ask Emmett Cassiano to lead us in a song for these people.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Yeah. Happy birthday song. Ready? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear reverends. Happy birthday to you.
Harold, would you sit wherever you'd like.
Okay.
Harold does anything he wants to, and we just
And they'll be here for you to speak with and enjoy a cupcake with afterward, and then then you'll head over for the book signing. Now, Greg here will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Janice. And thank all of you who have come today. As Janice mentioned, this is our final speaker event of 2022. This is event number 10, but you're going to be hearing and once again seeing speaker number 9 because James Scott, who was with us in May, is following up almost chronologically with the topic he spoke on. In May, for those of you who are here, James presented his book, Target Tokyo, regarding the Jimmy Doolittle raid on Tokyo, which was in the spring of 1942. Just 3 years later, any trouble hearing me in the back?
Just a little louder, please.
Yeah.
Hold that up.
I think I need to be right in here.
There you go.
Okay, I'll hold it. 3 years after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, so in the spring of 1945, there was a much larger military event, which was, at the time and maybe even since, the most catastrophic air attack that anyone has seen, and that was the air raid on Tokyo, conducted by American B-29 bombers. James has researched, as with the Doolittle raid, he has researched this subject in great depth, and I'm very, very pleased that he's taking the time to share with us, because James lives in South Carolina, but he has very much become a friend from Western North Carolina. He's a friend of Brevard. He's very much a friend of our museum, and it's really a pleasure that he is here. As Janice mentioned, I'm handing the baton for leadership of the program to Mike Bazinet and Mike McCarthy. I assure you from what I already know, 2023 is going to be better than 2022. So please stick with us. I'm looking forward to it. And James, if you join us now, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Is this okay for the lights?
That's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, we're just going to dim them a little bit so that the slides pop out a little bit more. Is that okay? Can everybody hear me better in the back now? Yep. Well, Greg, thank you so much for the warm introduction, and thank you as well for you and Mike for a wonderful lunch today at Rocky's. That was I can't admit this at home, but that grilled pimento cheese sandwich was a lot better than the one my wife makes. So, I know those are fighting words, but I'll tell you, that was a spectacular lunch today. So, it's great to be back up and join you guys. It's great. Actually, Ed and I were just together this past weekend in Gettysburg for a conference there, so it's a real treat to get to pop in. Thank you as well, all of our World War II veterans for turning out today and for your service, and of course all of our other veterans from other conflicts as well. So it's just a real treat to get to come up and share a little bit about my latest book, Black Snow. Now at sunset on the night of March 9th, 1945, more than 300 American bombers lifted off from runways in the Mariana Islands, bound for Tokyo. Plans called for the bombers to fly barely a mile above the ground into one of the most heavily defended cities on the planet. No fighters would accompany them. Ground crews, in fact, had gone so far as to strip most of the bombers of their guns. To most, this was a suicide mission. The operation's architect believed otherwise, and he was right. The payloads of incendiaries that those bombers dropped shortly past midnight ignited one of the world's worst firestorms, an inferno hot enough to liquefy asphalt and vaporize thousands. That March mission not only devastated Tokyo, but represented a significant moral turning point for the United States, which up until that moment had resisted the intentional killing of civilians. That operation sparked a 159-day air campaign, virtually unrivaled in its destruction, as city after city soon fell, culminating in the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. More importantly, the campaign's success prevented a bloody American invasion, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. All of this combines to make the March 9th strike on Tokyo one of the most consequential decisions of World War II, and also one of the most fascinating stories. Now to begin, I'd like to rewind to the fall of 1944 and introduce you to Brigadier General Haywood Hansel, who's the 41-year-old leader of the 21st Bomber Company, a job in which he served as America's top prosecutor in the new air war against the Empire of Japan. Now, Hansel had long ago earned the most unfortunate nickname, Possum. He would swear it was actually a compliment derived from his agile and crafty intellect. But his wife later slipped up and let it be known that the dreadful name's origin had more to do with his physical resemblance to North America's only marsupial. You tell me, do you see the resemblance? I think it's the eyes. Now, Hansel had spent his life building up to this moment. He boasted relatives who'd fought in every major war dating back to the American Revolution. His own father, a devout Georgia Southerner, had served as a surgeon in the Army and tours in the Philippines and China. Hansel's first words as a baby, in fact, were in Mandarin. The general's youthful appearance camouflaged a drive that made him both a gifted fighter pilot early in his career, as well as a thinker who helped design the Air Force's war plan against Germany. At his core, however, Hansel was a Southern gentleman whose love of writing verse made him the Air Force's unofficial poet laureate. The genteel general who liked to recite Shakespeare and adored Gilbert and Sullivan operas approached combat in a similar manner. He despised the firebombing of cities that had defined the British air war in Europe, while instead advocating that America execute high-altitude, daylight precision raids designed to knock out an enemy's industry while minimizing civilian deaths. But Hansel, as he soon discovered, had taken on a massive challenge in the Pacific. The fight to retake Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the summer of 1944 had proven incredibly destructive, costing America 25,000 dead and wounded. But this prized Pacific real estate had for the first time placed Tokyo in range of American bombers, in fact reflected in the enemy's ferocious fight, including the largest suicide charge of the war, which had led to 4,300 Japanese deaths in just a few hours. 6 days after the June 15th invasion of Saipan, the first aviation engineers had waded ashore, tasked with turning the 48-square-mile island into Hansel's air base. The job had proven Herculean. Not only had the battle reduced Saipan's towns and villages to rubble, but the island's few roads could handle little more than ox carts. Engineers armed with dynamite, jackhammers, and bulldozers leveled hills, blasted coral quarries, and cut roads through sugarcane fields. Others, meanwhile, set out to erect the tents and Quonset huts that would serve as the operation buildings, mess halls, and officers' quarters. All of this, of course, was done as rogue Japanese snipers continued to target laborers, trucks, and planes in an effort to disrupt progress. But Hansel's challenges went beyond just base logistics and snipers. The first few missions to bomb Tokyo in late November 1944 had revealed that impenetrable clouds often blanketed the island nation, limiting visibility some months to as few as 3 days. In addition, crews battled hellacious jet streams over the empire that raged at speeds of up to 230 miles per hour and wrecked bombing accuracy. But Hansel wasn't the only one sweating out these early missions. Halfway around the world in Washington, Army Air Forces Commander General Hap Arnold anxiously monitored the results of each strike. Now, Arnold was an air power pioneer who had learned to fly from none other than Orville and Wilbur Wright in an Ohio cow pasture under the watchful eyes of a local undertaker who was convinced that aviation was bad. The only reason that early aviators actually wore those trademark goggles like you see on Arnold's forehead there is because a bug hit Arnold in the eye one time while landing. Now, in the span of his career, Arnold had seen aviation advance from the primitive wood and fabric biplanes like the Wright brothers plane there on his desk to muscular 4-engine bombers capable of bridging oceans and turning an entire nation into a battlefield. The rise of aviation had prompted Arnold to advocate for an air service independent of the Army, a view that had become a crusade. To make the case for an independent Air Force, Arnold needed his service to own an equal share of victory alongside the Army and the Navy. He had hoped that the air war in Europe might accomplish that. But despite the best efforts of British and American bomber crews, the fight there had devolved into a slog, becoming the conflict's longest battle. More American airmen, in fact, would die in the heavens over Europe than the Marine Corps would lose in the entire war. And in the end, the infantry still had to storm the beaches and retake villages, towns, and cities. But Japan offered Arnold another chance, a blank canvas on which he could paint the awesome power of his Air Force. More importantly, he realized, if he could not bring Japan to its knees through bombing, hundreds of thousands of American infantry would have no choice but to slosh ashore and battle inside Japan's cities in what promised to be a bloody invasion. Now, to accomplish these goals, Arnold had made one of the biggest gambles of World War II. He had spent $3.7 billion of taxpayer money to design and build the B-29 Superfortress. The B-29, in fact, proved the single most expensive weapon system of World War II, surpassing even the atomic bomb, which required an army of 129,000 workers, scientists, and engineers to develop. The staggering price tag of the B-29 no doubt had contributed to the 3 heart attacks Arnold had suffered in the 2 years leading up to America's first strike on Japan. Now, developed by Boeing, the 4-engine bomber proved an engineering marvel, assembled out of 55,000 parts. Construction of the nearly 4,000 B-29s Arnold ordered had proven an aeronautical gold rush, as the promise of steady jobs attracted tens of thousands of prospective laborers to the few factories around the country that manufactured. To accomplish this labor force, the federal government went so far as to build a brand new city in Kansas called Plainview, just to house the army of workers. Plainview not only had to have housing, but it also had to have schools, shopping malls, and even movie theaters. Overnight, it mushroomed into one of the largest cities in Kansas, prompting residents there to dub it the Miracle City. With a tail that rose as high as a 3-story building, the Superfortress boasted the largest propellers ever fitted on a plane, along with a sprawling 141-foot wingspan. That's 20 feet longer than the Wright brothers' first flight. But the B-29, as Hansel soon discovered, proved a troublesome new plane, often prone to engine fires. Mechanical problems on a 3,000-mile round-trip flight to Tokyo could doom a crew who looked down for hours on nothing but cold, dark, and forbidding waters. Quote, sometimes, one pilot later said, we wondered whether the battle was with the Japanese or the B-29. Now, to combat these engine fires, ground crew actually on startup stood beneath each engine holding a fire extinguisher, which you can imagine is a very comforting sight when you're looking out of that cockpit while sitting on about 8,000 gallons of fuel. As November rolled into December, however, Hansel continued to struggle. His early missions aimed to knock out Japan's aircraft industry, but post-strike photos revealed his crews were lucky to hit within 1,000 feet of the target, much less destroy it. Mission after mission soon proved a bust. Now, the failure of these strikes sparked tensions. Brigadier General Rosie O'Donnell, pictured here on the left, who was Hansel's lead wing commander. Now, O'Donnell had been a veteran of the early fights in the Philippines, and he felt that Hansel should abandon high-altitude precision bombing and instead firebomb Japanese cities at night, the same approach that the British had taken in Europe. Unlike Hansel, who monitored the missions from the safety of Saipan, O'Donnell flew through, with his crews through black clouds of bursting flak while dodging enemy fighters. Problematic tactics, he knew, killed him. O'Donnell was reminded of that each time he sat down to write letters to the mothers and fathers, wives and siblings of the men killed in the heavens over Japan. Nearly 1,200 pages of such letters would ultimately fill multiple binders that he would keep for the rest of his life. Now, to make matters worse for Hansel, the Japanese, outraged by these early strikes on Tokyo, retaliated, raiding Saipan day and night from Iwo Jima, which is about 700 miles to the northwest, and at this point was still in Japanese control. Over the course of 13 raids, Japanese bombers and fighters destroyed or damaged 60 of Hansel's B-29s. These raids not only incinerated Hansel's precious few bombers, but also rattled the already exhausted air crews who, after flying grueling 15 and 16-hour missions, returned to base only to have their sleep wrecked by midnight raids by the Japanese. The air war against Japan, much like his battle with Rosie O'Donnell, was shaping up as a pivotal test of Hansel's fundamental beliefs about bombardment, ideas that had come to define him. Now, while firebombing cities horrified Hansel, other American leaders increasingly disagreed. It was hard not to watch German cities burn and wonder if such tactics might not work against Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. America, in fact, had already begun planning for the possible adoption of such tactics, beginning with the development of a new incendiary bomb, filled with a flammable gasoline jelly called napalm, which was first tested on the Harvard soccer field on Independence Day 1942. To further test this new weapon, America actually went so far as to build a mock Japanese village in the deserts of Utah. One so authentic that craftsmen actually swapped out nails for wooden pegs. Engineers He even built a factory to produce the woven tatami mats, that iconic floor covering we find inside Japanese homes. You can see here other details that are added: sliding screen doors, seating pillows, and tables. This is actually a photograph from inside one of those mock homes. Over the course of the summer of 1943, America incinerated that village, rebuilt it, and burned it again, only to repeat that over and over and over again. At the same time, back in Washington, analysts had begun studying the devastating effects of a 1923 earthquake and fire that had destroyed much of Tokyo and Yokohama. That tragic natural disaster, which had claimed more than 100,000 lives, had revealed the enemy's Achilles heel: dense wooden cities that were highly susceptible to fire. Now, back on Saipan, meanwhile, Hansel continued to struggle. By the end of 1944, despite having flown 8 missions against Tokyo and Nagoya, Hansel had failed to destroy a single factory. Japan's war machine still hummed, and Hap Arnold was out of patience. Arnold fired Hansel in January of 1945, replacing him with Major General Curtis LeMay. Now, the 38-year-old LeMay is everything that Hansel was not. LeMay lacked the social grace and the polish of his poetic predecessor, a factor derived from his less than genteel upbringing. LeMay's physical resemblance to a bulldog mirrored his stern reputation, which, coupled with his dislike of chit-chat, or really talk in general, had earned him the nickname the Diplomat. That was the kinder of his many nicknames. Crews underneath him often called him simply Iron Ass. Now, unlike Hansel, who was raised in comfort, LeMay had suffered a hard-scrabbled childhood, one whose adversities had shaped the warrior he'd grown up to become. Now, his father had been a dreamer and a ne'er-do-well who'd bounced the family from Ohio to Montana to California, all around the country as he sought out different manual labor jobs. His mother cleaned houses to help supplement the family's income. She had the highest education in the household. She'd only made it to the 8th grade. LeMay learned at an early age that he could depend on no one in life but himself. He put himself through college, in fact, at Ohio State studying engineer by working all night in a steel mill. Imagine getting off work at 4 o'clock in the morning, only to have to then be in an engineering class a few hours later. Soon after the outbreak of the war, LeMay was diagnosed with Bell's palsy, which is a form of facial paralysis, which caused his right cheek to droop. To hide the residual effects, LeMay often chewed on a cigar, which later became an indelible part of his image. Now, LeMay's difficult upbringing had made him a tireless worker, a leader who gave tremendously of himself to the war. He was lucky to score a few hours of sleep at night. A theme, in fact, in all his letters home was his exhaustion. I wonder, he wrote, if there will ever come a time when I'll get all the sleep I can get. LeMay spent much of the war overseas, which came at great sacrifice to his wife and young daughter at home. On a brief visit back to Ohio in late '44, he actually stopped off to visit his family, and there his daughter insisted that he sit on a cold winter night on the front porch swing for over an hour. Despite his pleading that they should go back inside for the warmth, she insisted they stay put. Only later did his wife confide to him that the reason his daughter Janie wanted him to sit outside in the cold for as long as she did was because she wanted to prove to all the other kids on the block that she actually had a father. Now, gifted pilot and navigator, LeMay had proven to be a daring commander in Europe. His background in engineering made him a natural problem solver, which he used to pioneer longer bomb runs and develop new formations that helped B-17s maximize their defense. Over time, he won the admiration and respect of both his superiors and also his men. Quote, if LeMay said 2 + 2 = 5, one of his airmen said, I'd believe it. Now, upon landing on Guam, LeMay came face to face with Hansel, whom he'd been ordered to replace. Now, Hansel and LeMay were actually friends. They'd fought together in Europe. Hansel, in fact, had been LeMay's boss at that time. When I was going through LeMay's personal papers, I found a commendation letter that Hansel had written for LeMay. He also advocated for LeMay's promotion to brigadier general. And now, literally just a couple of years later, LeMay lands on Guam to replace his former boss. He also outranks him by a star. But Hansel, always the Southern gentleman, refused to hold that against LeMay. But he did offer him some parting advice. He told LeMay that he hoped, despite pressures he would get from Washington, that he would continue to fly high-altitude daylight precision raids and resist the temptation to fire bombs. Remember, he told LeMay, in the end, we will be judged not by whether we win the war, but by how we win the war. Now, LeMay initially followed Hansel's advice. A pragmatist, he set out to solve the problem of how best to bomb Japan. He dropped his bombers from 30,000 feet down to 25,000 feet, hoping to bring them in under the roaring jet streams. He likewise established schools to improve pilot, navigator, and bombardier performance. Though Hansel had been reluctant to embrace radar, LeMay pressed his crews to use it. LeMay also revamped his maintenance system to increase performance of his planes. A grounded bomber, he always said, can't drop bombs. Despite all these efforts, however, LeMay, like Hansel, struggled with Japan's terrible cloud cover and ferocious jet streams, which combined to stymie attacks. The days soon turned to weeks, as January 1945 rolled into February and then March. Yet American bombing results remained poor. The stress not only weighed on LeMay, but also his crews, who day after day had to return to the same target, battling enemy fighters and flak. Quote, each month here, one officer wrote to his wife, seemed like a year. Others couldn't help but stare down for hours at those dreaded dark waters. Quote, old man ocean is a mean devil, pilot Wilford Lynn wrote. The myriad number of things that can put you down in that ocean makes my knees weak, and I begin to wonder what I ever did to make God so mad at me. Back in Washington, Hap Arnold, worn down by the war stress, suffered his fourth heart attack. All of this only added to the pressure that already weighed upon LeMay's shoulders. He needed only to look at what happened to his former boss, Haywood Hansel, to know the fate that awaited him if he failed to produce results. Quote, if you don't succeed, Arnold's chief of staff warned LeMay, you will be fired. LeMay had sensed the buzzards were circling. Something had to change, and fast. With all of this in mind, LeMay, as I noted earlier, was just 38 years old at the time, made what proved to be one of the most consequential decisions of the war. To successfully attack the enemy, he realized, required a radical rethinking of American strategy. One so unorthodox, one so perilous, and one so morally fraught that he would go it alone. LeMay decided to drop his bombers as low as 5,000 feet, bringing them in far beneath the cloud cover and the roaring jet streams. The lower altitude would expose them to Tokyo's anti-aircraft guns and fighters, turning the raid into a potential Turkey shoot. To counter this, LeMay planned to push his attacks from day to night, providing his air crews the cover of darkness. He likewise ordered his bombers stripped of guns, largely because he was afraid at night in the darkness they might shoot each other down. Without weapons, however, there was no need to carry ammunition or even gunners, which freed up more weight to carry more bombs. Lastly, he planned to send every single plane in his arsenal. More than 300 would lift off from runways in the Marianas and rendezvous in the skies over Tokyo in a mission dubbed Operation Meeting House. The tactics were not the only change. LeMay planned to swap out his demolition bombs for napalm-filled incendiaries, the same ones that had proven so successful in burning the mock Japanese village America had in the deserts of Utah. The mission's 12 square mile target area was 87.4% residential. It boasted the greatest population density in all of Tokyo. Right here in Asakusa Ward, it was about 135,000 people per square mile. Overall, in this entire target area, the average population density was 103,000 people per square mile. That meant that the mission's bullseye fell largely on the kitchens, the living rooms, and the bedrooms of Japan's workers. LeMay justified this decision because many such homes doubled as small factories, a vital cottage industry that fed parts to Japan's ravenous war machine. Literally 50% of Tokyo's industrial output came from such homes that produced pins for hand grenades, triggers for rifles, and small parts like that. LeMay, of course, knew that incendiaries did not discriminate. The fires his bombers set would burn everything and everyone in their path, from factory and armaments workers to artists and teachers. Quote, "We knew we were going to kill a lot of women and kids when we burned that town," he later said. "It had to be done." To his aides, he was even more blunt. "If we lose this war," LeMay warned, "we will be war criminals." Beyond the moral questions, the mission ran contrary to America's long-standing policy of daylight, high-altitude precision bombing, tactics that Hansel had embraced and that America had adhered to for years in the air war over Europe. And now LeMay, without any approval from the President, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or even half-armed, proposed to change everything. The mission, of course, wasn't without its serious risks. LeMay's intelligence officers warned him that at such low altitudes, he could expect to lose up to 70% of his force. That translated into a potential loss of more than 200 planes and the lives of 2,200 airmen. That wasn't lost on his crews. Quote, "We were dumbfounded," recalled pilot Ben Robinson. "The tactics to be used on this mission were tantamount to suicide." But LeMay doubted such predictions and believed it was a calculated risk worth taking. Crews, meanwhile, hustled to fuel the more than 300 bombers, while others hoisted incendiaries into the B-29's bellies. LeMay arrived at Guam's North Field shortly before sunset on March 9, 1945. There, he watched the first B-29 lift off at 5:36 p.m. Others followed from runways on Saipan and Tinian at 50-second intervals. Even at that rapid pace, it would still take several hours to launch the more than 300 bombers, forming a loose, single-file line that stretched more than several hundred miles along what the airmen call Hirohito's highway. Throughout the bombers, tension soared as crews maintained radio silence. Quote, "We had hours to think of the many things you do when under high stress," recalled pilot John Cox. What was going to happen? Would we be able to do the job? Would we ever see home again? 1 hour soon turned to 2, then 3, and 4. Now, it was a cold March night in Tokyo. Snow, which had fallen a few days earlier, blanketed the narrow streets and few parks. Though the sky was clear that Friday, gusts of bitter wind blew out of the northwest, chilling those brave enough to venture outside. 7 minutes past midnight, the first bombers arrived over Tokyo, a skyline that would soon be lit by searchlights. Their bomb bay doors sprung open, spewing loads of incendiaries. Fires soon ignited across the target area, ultimately melding with others to create an inferno. As flames feasted on the wooden city, the resulting hot air rushed skyward, creating thermal updrafts that battered the bombers, while embers blew like seeds, helping to pollinate new blazes. At the same time, that depletion of oxygen at the center of the fire created a vacuum, pulling in air, fresh air from the perimeter to fuel this growing inferno. That rush of air, which can reach hurricane-force speeds, spawned a firestorm similar to what devoured Dresden. Now, fires in the Jodo ward all merged ultimately, and that's sort of just outside the target area here, to create a single blaze that ultimately feasted on that entire district. Same thing happened in Asakusa ward, Honjo ward, and Fukagawa ward. And eventually all of these collided into one to create a single blaze that spread across 4 of Tokyo's major districts there. The winds then blew this blaze leeward, creating what amounted to a tidal wave of fire 3 miles long that would roll across the capital, feeding on block after block in the city. Residents could look skyward to see this terrifying phenomenon bearing down on them. It seemed, one survivor later said, like a wave crest approaching from beyond the ocean. Like many in the capital, 12-year-old Katsumoto Satome was in bed as the first bombers buzzed overhead. From a poor working-class family, the junior high school student had been conscripted for the war effort, hauling scrap metal for Kubota Ironworks on the banks of the Sumida River. He and his sisters were actually asleep in bed when his father burst into their room and shouted for them to wake up. The roar of the bombers greeted him when he opened his eyes, and despite blackout curtains, it was so bright in his room that he could actually read the characters on a wall calendar. Now, as Katsumoto and his family fled, bombs continued to rain down. Across Tokyo, residents climbed into home bunkers, which were often little more than primitive foxholes. Others sought out concrete structures like schools, train stations, and government offices. Lastly, residents fled toward the city's few large parks, which served as the only real open spaces in this otherwise heavily congested city. So what was it like for those residents trapped inside this firestorm? That was the key question that I asked survivors in Tokyo when I was interviewing this book. There are, of course, no photos that were taken during the firestorm, but a number of survivors did do paintings afterwards to help illustrate what it was like, including the survivor here who painted herself as a 13-year-old girl right here. Now, the glow of the fire literally turned day into night, illuminating the capital as though it were noontime. And the fires produced a deafening roar like a freight train, loud enough to drown out the cries of people. The air, as you can imagine, was scorching, burned your throat. It was hard just to open your eyes. People struggled to breathe. And as the temperature rose, people's clothes and even hair began to spontaneously burst into flames. Eyelashes melted and asphalt roads liquefied, turning into a sticky goo that clung to people's shoe soles. Those residents who sought shelter in these primitive home bunkers, for the most part, largely all died. So too did many people who were caught out in the open in residential areas and in the blizzard of sparks. Concrete buildings like schools, train stations initially provided a safe haven until surrounded by flames. And then temperatures soared to the point that the glass in the windows and the doors began to liquefy, allowing that rush of sparks and hot air to enter these buildings. At that point, hallways and staircases began to function like chimneys, funneling superheated air and toxic gases throughout the buildings. Now, this nondescript photograph here actually documents one of the hottest places American investigators found in Tokyo afterwards. It's hard to read that caption there, but these two ground floor windows, the flames were so hot that the rebar in them actually melted. And so too did the concrete around them, as you can see here. Just so you know, concrete doesn't begin to break down until temperatures reach about 2,800 degrees. Those residents who were able fled toward the city's few open parks and bridges, many of whom suffered a similar fate as those elsewhere. In an act of desperation, many of them plunged into the Sumida River, which is one of the largest open areas in the city, only to suffocate, drown, or be overwhelmed from carbon monoxide. To give you another sense, too, of just how hot temperatures were inside this inferno, take a look at the image in the top left-hand corner. That's actually kitchenware fused together with clay roof tiles. And what happened in that situation is, as a home burned, the roof collapsed into the kitchen area where the tiles then melted together with kitchenware. The bottom right-hand image is a similar story. It is actually corrugated metal roofing that later fused together with kitchenware. Lastly, fires in Tokyo proved hot enough even to melt coins together. For nearly 3 hours in the skies over Tokyo, bomber after bomber unloaded its payload. As the inferno grew, pilots could see the glow of the dying city from 50 miles away, then 100, then 200. From the cockpit, the ground below appeared to move like lava, prompting many of the airmen to compare it to Dante's Inferno. Quote, "It felt like you were staring into the mouth of hell," recalled Second Lieutenant David Brady. Smoke from the fires, meanwhile, wafted up into the heavens, where they were pulled in through the bomb bay doors to circulate amongst the air system there inside the planes, carrying with it that distinct aroma of barbecued flesh, horses, dogs, and even people. It was, as pilot Charles Phillips later noted, the smell of death. The sun rose over Tokyo the morning of March 10th to reveal an apocalyptic wasteland, smoldering ruins interrupted only by the occasional brick chimney that you can see here on the horizon from a torched bathhouse or factory. By morning, the fires were all largely out because there was no fuel left in the city for them to burn. Fires in that 6-hour period from midnight until about daybreak had devoured an astonishing 15.8 square miles of the enemy's capital. The inferno had claimed the lives of 105,000 people. That sum is more than 4 times the number of people who died in Dresden. The strike wounded another 40,000 and left 1 million homes. Literally 1 out of every 4 buildings in Tokyo was destroyed that night. 12-year-old Katsumoto Satome and his family had miraculously survived, escaping across the Sumida River on a railroad bridge and outside of the target area's perimeter. Next morning, they made their way back into the city to see what had happened to their home. There, they paused along the banks of the Sumida River, where crews were pulling the dead out. The youth watched as men used poles and ropes to steer the body toward the banks. There, they lifted them out and lined them up, he recalled, like fish in a market. Katsumoto, his father, admonished him, "Look at this. Don't forget it. This is what war looks like." Identification of the dead, as you can imagine, was difficult. People opened the mouths, bodies to look for gold teeth, scanned fingers for rings. And many of them learned that on a burned body, if you lifted the arm, inside the armpit, you might find a piece of unburned fabric that would give you an idea of what kind of color kimono or outfit people were wearing. Bodies of the dead would ultimately have filled 67 cemeteries, dug into the yards of schools, temples, and parks, government buildings, pretty much everywhere. Back in Washington, meanwhile, officials monitored the nation's editorial pages and radio broadcasts for evidence that the killing of civilians might spark outrage among the American public. Those fears, however, proved unfounded. Japan, a nation that had horrified the world with the attack of Pearl Harbor, followed by the murder of hundreds of thousands of civilians in places like Nanking, Manila, Hong Kong, and Singapore, garnered little support. What properly kindled, Time magazine wrote the next week, Japanese cities will burn like autumn leaves. The lack of any public backlash served as a green light for LeMay, who over the next 5 months unleashed a level of fury unrivaled in the history of warfare. City after city, town after town soon fell victim to LeMay's bombers. His initial focus on urban industrial areas like Tokyo, where home factories contributed to the war effort, faded as the attacks continued and his list of cities dwindled. In the latter raids, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded the number one factor driving a city's target selection came down to combustibility. LeMay's campaign ultimately culminated on the morning of August 6th with the atomic attack on Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by the destruction of Nagasaki. Only then, with dozens of its cities in ruin, did Japanese leaders finally give up and surrender. In the 159 days from the strike on Tokyo, until Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's intention to surrender, LeMay torched 66 Japanese cities, ultimately incinerating 178 square miles. Tokyo suffered the worst. Over another 5 raids that followed that one in March, American bombers ultimately flattened 56 square miles of Japanese county. To put that in perspective, Manhattan Island is only 21 square miles. All told, America's bombing campaign against the Japanese homeland killed about 330,000 people, injured nearly 500,000 more, and left 8.5 million people homeless, creating one of the largest migrations of people during the 20th century. All of those folks that lived in urban cities migrated out into the countryside of Japan. LeMay had, in the end, accomplished exactly what Hap Arnold had wanted. He had brought Japan to its knees without the army having to put boots on the beaches of Honshu, saving hundreds of thousands of American lives. Even Haywood Hansel, who was crushed at losing his dream job as the commander of the 21st Bomber Command, believed LeMay, in destroying Tokyo, had made, quote, a shrewd and courageous decision. In my mind, Hansel said, that decision was one of the most important decisions of the entire war. It was a personal decision, not a consensus, and he alone should have been correct. And that concludes my uplifting talk here on Wednesday afternoon. So I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you guys so much Hey, John.
Is there a thought that, I never thought about this before, but if we had not bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, do you have any, or is there any evidence that Japan was just about to give it up anyway, or did it really take those two atomic blasts to really push it?
Yeah, so for folks who may not have been able to hear, John asked basically how important were the atomic attacks in bringing Japan, after all the firebombing campaign, bringing Japan to the point of surrender. And the reality is they're significant. They're what did. In fact, after the Tokyo raid, George Marshall was stunned that the Japanese didn't surrender. Instead, they continued to fight on. And so there was actually a lot of fear after Hiroshima when Japan didn't surrender right away that even the atomic attack hadn't done it. And so, but the reality is, Japan, they had this misguided idea that if they could somehow hold out long enough, they could get one more battle victory and give themselves a better position at the bargaining table. Because what they didn't want was unconditional surrender. They wanted to be able to surrender, but still be able to protect the emperor and his role in Japanese culture. And so they kept hoping if we just hold out, we hold out. And, of course, that was never going to happen. I mean, Japan, their Navy was eradicated. Their Air Force was pretty much destroyed by this point. They were like a boxer pinned on the road, just taking punch after punch after punch. And that reality. So what they needed at that point was really a face-saving way out of the war. And that's what the atomic bombs provided. Hirohito, if you actually listen to or read the transcript, it's about 600 words of the speech that he made to Japanese people on August 15th. He cites the atomic bomb in its totality. This is why we're doing this. The Americans have this new weapon that will eradicate society. We had no choice but to do it. So in a lot of ways, the atomic bombs were political. And I will actually think that really it's not Hiroshima, it's Nagasaki actually. That's the more important thing to me. Because after the first bomb, Japan, basically all decisions are made in Japan by a panel of 6 guys and the emperor. He sort of sits on the sidelines. It's the big 6, and it's his leading military advisors. And after Hiroshima, a majority of them are still saying we should hold on. They can't have more than one of these bombs. We'll just keep riding it out. Japan is prepared. It's called Ketsugo, which was a sort of a defense of the homelands they put in place in January 1945, where they were going to fight to the finish. They were arming children and grandparents with spears. They moved 900,000 troops down to Kyushu to prepare for the Americans' initial landing there. I mean, they were preparing to fight this out. And they thought, well, the Americans can't have more than one of these weapons. And then Nagasaki happens 3 days later. And at that point, you see this sense that, hey, they just dropped a second one just a couple of days later. They may have 100 of these things. And that's what then prompts the emperor to sort of cast that tie, breaking Japan's surrender. Even then, surrender is not a certainty. There's an effort to overthrow the emperor right before that speech can be done. He actually records his speech. It's on a phonograph record. It's protected in a vault. He's hidden in an underground bunker. And a number of these officers attempt to, take him into protective custody on the 14th, which in Japanese terms is executed, because they're hell bent on continuing to fight.
I read this, that Colonel LeMay got in touch with Tibbets after Nagasaki and asked Tibbets if there was another bomb. And Tibbets said yes.
Yeah. It was one more in the works. They didn't have it yet. It was in the works. Yeah.
Because they didn't surrender immediately after Nagasaki.
And actually, after Hiroshima, there's like this 48-hour panic period everybody's like, okay, that didn't do it. You know, we'd only have 2 of these things. So how much more? We'd already greenlit the invasion of Kyushu. Truman had already signed off on that on June 18th. I mean, we were beginning the logistics work, the build up, and all that. So I mean, it was and what we had seen in places like Manila, 17,000 Japanese troops up against MacArthur's forces, total destruction of the city, 100,000 civilians killed. What we'd seen on Tarawa, Peleliu, I mean, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, I mean, it was just going to be horrific. That was the great fear. How can they end the war without having that kind of battle on that much larger scale? Yes, sir.
What were the aircraft losses
On this mission?
Well, in this campaign, and what was the altitude that were flying? They had to fly below clouds.
Yeah. So you asked about aircraft losses on the March mission. That's a good point. I actually need to add that in. So of course, LeMay's fearing that he's being told he could lose up to 70%. Out of 325 bombers that take off, he loses 14. And so it's under 5%. We don't know exactly why all those were lost. Some of them were probably flak, some of them were probably mid-air collisions. The thermal updraft just battered these bombers. I mean, their altitudes were changing by thousands of feet within just a few seconds. They were, because you have to understand that this escaping heat is just a violent force. The bombers returned to base that next morning. The bottoms of their planes were black with soot. The heat had actually bubbled the paint on some of them. And so we don't know, about 7 of them, we don't know why they were lost. I was actually giving a talk in Richmond last month, though, and the son of one of the men lost on that mission. He was there. And he never knew his father. He was born in June. His father was killed in March. So he never knew. As for losses, they were kind of all over the place because losses were pretty heavy early on. The Japanese had a lot of fighters early on when we were flying these high-altitude missions. As we were concentrating on Tokyo and Nagoya, because that was where our initial targets were their aircraft industry, because we wanted to wipe out their ability to put more planes in the skies, take control of the skies. So we were targeting, most of that was Tokyo and Nagoya, so Japan moved all of its flak guns into those areas, and they created what they call Flak Alley. And so losses were pretty heavy. Those losses, after March, the Japanese are still fighting back. In fact, we have 2 really awful missions in May over Tokyo, in which I think like 20-some planes were lost. After that, it really drops off. Japan's out of fuel, they're run out of pilots, and the missions against a lot of the smaller cities, there's almost no opposition whatsoever. So by the end of the campaign, LeMay actually says, you know, it was safer to fly a mission over Tokyo than it was a training mission back in the U.S. So, yes, sir.
There was a time that'll never come again because I remember the headlines. We drop an atomic bomb, and people say, hey, we dropped an atomic bomb, and the next day is, what the hell is an atomic bomb? There was such secrecy with the uranium and the manufacture of the bomb. Could never happen again.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, considering how big the Manhattan Project was, that secrecy remained to the level it did all the way up until, and that's one of the fascinating things. I mean, Trinity takes place, the first ever test takes place, you know, just 3 weeks before Hiroshima. I mean, that morning, you know, Trinity takes place July 16th. A few hours later, the Indianapolis leaves San Francisco bound for the Marianas Islands with the first parts of, you know, the Hiroshima bomb. I mean, just the movement was so quick at that point to bring this around. But, yeah. Mike, all the way back.
What's the significance of your title, Black Snow?
Yeah. So the Japanese called it the Night of the Black Snow. And you can imagine with the soot and the embers raining down kind of where that imagery comes from. And so we took that title straight out of what the Japanese call what happened in Tokyo. But it's too much to try to fit the night of the Black Snow subtitle. So we shortened it. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right. Thank you guys so much.